BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Thursday. Welcome to the first official Dahlia Thursday here on Black Box Online Radio. This is a true crime channel, but I've decided to devote a significant portion of this channel's efforts to focusing on the Black Dahlia murder, the murder of Elizabeth Short from 1947. Last week I did an introductory episode where I was just providing my basic preliminary understandings of the Black Dahlia case, and in this episode I will be looking at the psychological and criminal profile that was created by John Douglas, who is more or less the father of the FBI profiling unit, and his material was detailed in the book The Cases That Haunt Us that he co-wrote with Mark Olshaker. And the way that I'm going to do this episode is I'm going to provide some introductory statements about the Black Dahlia. I'll look at John Douglas's observations, and then I will give my response. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the Black Dahlia murder. And for larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Black Box Ned. So last week, I gave my own introductory statements, as I said, and there really weren't too many things in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, that appeared to be contradictory to my original set of events that took place. We're going back to January 15th of 1947. At approximately 10 a.m., a woman and her 3-year-old daughter were walking down the street in Southern California, and they saw what they thought was a department store mannequin that was on the ground, but it was actually the body of Elizabeth Short. The reason why they thought she was a mannequin was because her body had been surgically cut in half, and one of the only differences from my recap last week was the body was placed approximately 10 inches apart. The top half of her body and the lower half of her body were placed approximately 10 inches apart. In last week's episode, I said it was 15 inches. That was just going off of memory, probably from Steve Hodel's analysis. But some of the details about what happened to Elizabeth Short are very graphic, so giving this as a disclaimer. Her breasts were cut apart very roughly. Her vaginal area had either been shaved or plucked, and an incision was made from the vaginal area up to her belly button. She had also been force-fed excrement prior to her death. She had been tied up. There were ligature marks on her arms and legs, which not only suggested that she was bound, but that she had been suspended in the air. So there's several different factors that are already going on. She was not only murdered, she was also either tortured or humiliated. But they estimated that her body had that she had passed away 10 hours before the disposal, before she was placed at the dump site. But they suspected that her body had been refrigerated because of the time that had took place. And I think that's a very good observation, because if her body had been placed there at 10 a.m., this would have taken an enormous amount of time to commit these types of surgical mutilations. And, I mean, it's quite possible that the murder took place at some time on the night of January 14th, or even the evening of January 14th, and that she was held in some type of refrigerator or preserving state prior to the disposal of the body at 10 a.m., because there were witnesses who went by at 8:30 in the morning. And they did not report seeing anything in that part of the city. So this would indicate that the disposal of Elizabeth Short's remains took place at some time between 8:45 and 9:45 in the morning on January 15th of 1947. Just some good things to keep in mind. Now, as I'm going through John Douglas's book, one of the first things that he says about Elizabeth Short is that she lived in a tragic and pathetic existence. Tragic and pathetic are the words that are used, and I absolutely did not like this statement at all, because one thing that I really try to do on Black Box Online Radio is avoid any type of victim shaming, victim blaming, or even insulting the victims. So I would hope that John Douglas and Mark Olshaker were saying the word pathetic, saying that Elizabeth Short lived in a pathetic existence. I would hope that they were doing that in the classical sense, where it just means evoking emotion, because I would even call that insulting the victim if they actually meant it in the more conventional sense. But some of the original observations that were made by John Douglas were as follows. He stated, this is almost the first thing that is in the book, that her body was found in a vacant lot. And that means that somebody brought her there. And I read that in the book, and I'm like, wow, brilliant profiling there, sir. Her body was found in a vacant lot. That means that somebody had transported her body to the lot. And that's just the way that it's structured in the book, and it's a little bit awkward, but I completely understood what he was saying. This means that, again, these are John Douglas's observations. The killer had his own vehicle, and John Douglas also states that the killer had his own house where he could have committed these types of mutilations. Some other psychological observations that have been made by John Douglas. It's possible that this individual was heavily inspired by Jack the Ripper, the serial killer from the 1800s. It's also most likely that this person was dealing with a very intense mental illness, something that could even be a psychotic disorder or a combination of disorders. But even though they have a very disorganized mind, they are able to function in society. They're able to deal with it in the sense where they can fool people into thinking that they do not have a psychotic disorder, a mental illness, or a combination of mental illnesses. This person was also probably a chronic alcoholic. Again, an observation made by John Douglas. And this also goes to show that this individual didn't only want to murder Elizabeth Short. The fact that she was fed excrement shows that this was a humiliating aspect of the ritual. This person clearly has some type of animosity toward women. Again, this is not only murder, this is also degrading, humiliating, and mutilating and dismembering a woman. So a lot of these things I can agree with. A lot of these things I can completely comprehend. John Douglas is stating very clearly in the book that the killer has his own home and his own vehicle. And I'm just some guy reading the book. I am not a criminologist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a criminal profiler. But that bothered me for a particular reason. His own home and his own vehicle. How do we truly know that this person had his own home or his own vehicle? Because I can just think of an alternative that is very simple. He had access to his own home or his own vehicle, as evidenced by just the simple fact that, let's say, for example, if I come over to your home, whoever you are, and I commit a crime there, I'm not doing it in my home. He has access to a location where he could commit the crime in an uninterrupted way. And I think the reason why I'm thinking about this is because yesterday on Black Box Online Radio, I was talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper and the Thames Torso Killer. And the exact same issues came up almost, just by chance that these two stories of dismembering ladies happened in the Black Box Online Radio lineup. Because a big issue with the Thames Torso Killer is some people are thinking that the crime did not necessarily have to occur in anybody's home. It could have occurred in a place of employment. And think about this in regards to the killer. Could you not say that the crime occurred in somebody's place of employment if this person had access to a type of warehouse or a type of even slaughterhouse? Because one thing that is also emphasized by John Douglas in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, is the person who committed this murder may have been someone who had a very hands-on profession, also one that worked with blood, and this person could have been somebody who was a butcher or slaughterer, like slaughtering, animals, but this person also could have just been an avid hunter. So it seems like John Douglas is not completely certain on that, But if, again, this could be somebody who has access to a place of employment where he could have committed the crime, like a slaughterhouse, for example. And I know that this stuff with profiling is not like these are perfect formulas that tells you exactly what happened. It's just he seems so adamant and so certain about this in the book that the killer has his own home and he has his own vehicle. And I'm just thinking, I can think of so many scenarios or possibilities where maybe this killer did not have his own home or have his own vehicle. He could have been using someone else's vehicle for this. He could have been using a work-related vehicle that wasn't actually his, not his personal property. And let's also be clear, I'm fully aware that the FBI profiling unit likes to focus on the role of vehicles in somebody's life, and what does it say about the killer? I mean, Paul Rowland talked all about this in his book Killer Psychopaths, about how the vehicle can almost just be a window into the perpetrator's state of existence, because it's about how they would use the vehicle to commit the crimes. And with the body of Elizabeth Short, as we've already said, she was bisected, cut in half, and this would suggest that this person either used one large bag or two large bags that were involved with transporting her body to the dump site. Most likely her body was placed in two bags, and when she was put down on the ground, she was actually reportedly put down face first, as evidenced by the dirt and dew that was on her face, and then she was turned over. Now, Steve Hodel, who is the author of the Black Dahlia Avenger series, has stated that he believes that she was transported in cement or concrete bags that would be used for concrete mixing, and those would be very suitable. But I would expect that somebody who worked in a place like a slaughterhouse would also have access to something that could easily conceal the body of the victim. And I guess you could say that I completely get where John Douglas would be coming from about how this person has his own home, he has his own vehicle, and as Paul Rowland would point out, they have this ability to pay for the home, to pay for the vehicle. That means that they're going to need a job that can support all of these finances. And I'm just not there yet. I mean, I understand their reasoning, I understand the rationale. But once again, this could just simply be somebody who's taking advantage of his boss, taking advantage of somebody else, committing a crime with someone else's vehicle, committing a crime on someone else's property. Things like that are definitely possible. So, what do you think is more likely? Do you think that the Black Dahlia Avenger had his own car and his own house? Or do you think that he could have committed the crime in a location that wasn't his because he didn't want it traced back to him? Also thinking about a refrigerator unit that would be able to house Elizabeth Short's body for an extended period of time. If that indeed did happen, this would also sound like somebody has access to a facility rather than just committing the crime in their basement, so to speak. But what do you think? Let me know about all of these observations. Share anything you want in the comments section down below. And we had a comment come in last week where somebody was asking, what exactly do the terms Black Dahlia and Black Dahlia Avenger mean? The Black Dahlia was a name that was given to Elizabeth Short like a nickname because a dahlia is a type of flower, and she had silky black hair that almost resembled the flower's petals. And Elizabeth Short was also known to wear a black ring and sheer black underwear regularly, so she got the nickname the Black Dahlia, but it is most likely a reference to a film that came out 2 years earlier called The Blue Dahlia. And overall, though, I guess I would say that I think that we're probably dealing with somebody who is a younger male who is going to be in the categories of maybe ages 20 to 40. This could definitely be someone in his early 20s, and definitely someone who would be considerably older than that, up to age 40. One of the prime suspects that was discussed in the Black Dahlia case is George Hodel, and he was a medical doctor. Think about everything in John Douglas's psychological profile. He is somebody who had a hands-on profession, working with blood. Well, this doesn't have to be a slaughter or a butcher. This could have also been somebody like a surgeon. Again, hands-on, working with blood, and Steve Hodel would be all for that. And with George Hodel as a Black Dahlia suspect, there becomes a very particular motive in question, and that would be that he wanted to create a type of surrealist art piece because he could have been heavily inspired by a photographer named Man Ray, who would use women's bodies and turn them into images, and somebody as a medical doctor, like a medical doctor such as George Hodel, would have committed the murder because he wanted to go above and beyond the terms of conventional surrealist art and do something that was very, very, well, earth-shattering, something that would definitely get the world's attention, crossing different dimensions, so to speak. Yes, it is a crime, but in his mind it would have been something artistic related because of the twisted surrealist art scene of the 1940s. That's one possibility, but we do have to remember that there are also other possibilities out there, and all of these things are discussed in the book The Cases That Haunt Us by John Douglas and Mark Olshaker, where they say, now Elizabeth Short was a woman from Massachusetts who went to California for two clear reasons. One, she wanted to work in the film business, and also she wanted to marry a military serviceman. Elizabeth Short was 22 years old at the time. She was also known to have participated in dating activities. I'm not faulting her for any of that. She didn't deserve to be murdered. And could she have had an ex-boyfriend who worked in a profession that we've just said, working as a butcher or working as a surgeon even, a medical doctor, somebody who did this to her because of a revenge plot, or maybe not even an ex-boyfriend. What if it was somebody who was rejected by her, but definitely someone who felt like they had been cheated by Elizabeth Short in some way, and that wouldn't be some type of twisted surrealist art plot. That would just simply be a jealous and rejected lover, and blaming the ex-boyfriend, and all of that stuff should be considered. And there was also another person who's discussed in the book that we'll have to do a larger episode on in the future, and his name was Arnold Smith, and reportedly he made comments about how he wanted to rape Elizabeth Short, excuse me for being very graphic, but, he was looked into, and it appears that the authorities seemed mostly certain that he was not the killer, but, we're going to have to just keep exploring with this series here on the Black Dahlia, and one more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe. And one thing I wanted to do for this episode is to go back and read some of your questions and comments from last week, because I always think that you guys leave excellent comments, and working them into the episodes and discussions really creates for a different type of presentation. But we have one from Tori C, who says, great episode, Ned. From what I remember, was Hodel not the primary suspect of the detectives investigating? Well, to answer that question, Steve Hodel, his son, definitely claims that he was. And did he not essentially flee the country once the heat was on? Yes, first he went to Hawaii and then to the Philippines. I think the problem is that his son kind of went over the top with the rest of his theories, especially the Zodiac. I suspect that this was due to the media attention, publicity, and book sale that came in, and he wanted to keep it rolling. Absolutely, Steve Hodel may have been onto something, and he went over the top with accusing his father of just dozens and dozens of murders in the United States, North America, and around the world, some of the Zodiac ones. And I can tell, though, overall, only a handful of people actually believe that George Hodel was the Zodiac killer. A lot of people do indeed believe that he was the Black Dahlia Avenger. And we had a comment that came in from Lehman that I wanted to read off here that says, way too much Hodel. It is obvious to me that the son is out there to sell books and get deals, just like every other daddy-did-it person in true crime. As a researcher and historian, I can tell you hands down, the best researcher on the topic is Larry Harnish. Please, if you are seriously tackling this subject, Harnish is your best resource. And I'm definitely going to look into Larry Harnish's material because multiple people in the comments section requested hearing stuff about him and his material for this Dahlia Thursday segment. But I think that the motivation for last week's episode was to talk about how I was wrong. Back in 2019 and 2020, I had listened to Steve Hodel's presentations, and I was not convinced at all that George Hodel was the Zodiac killer, or that even he committed the Chop Chop murder in the Philippines. But as far as being the Black Dahlia Avenger, then I was mostly just accepted it. I was like, this guy's making a convincing case. It seems like he has some strong points. However, that was wrong on my part. I should not have jumped to the conclusion that George Hodel was the Black Dahlia Avenger just because I had found a convincing narrative. Just because something makes sense to you does not mean that this person actually was the killer. And there was another comment that came in about saying, what is it with the term Black Dahlia Avenger? Well, the Black Dahlia Avenger was the name that was used in letters that were written from someone who was the killer or pretending to be the killer. And I decided that for the purposes of this discussion series, I was going to refer to the killer as the Black Dahlia Avenger. Interestingly, about this Jack the Ripper connection that I mentioned early on, there was a film that was made in 1927 by Alfred Hitchcock called The Lodger, and it is heavily regarded as the first film that was made about Jack the Ripper. And it is a silent film, but it is an amazing piece of cinema. I've talked about it on Ripper Wednesday in the past. It features Ivor Novello playing we'll just say a suspect. But the killer is not called Jack the Ripper. The killer is called the Avenger. And it's been about 2 years since I've watched that movie, but I was just completely thinking Black Dahlia when I saw it. I mean, I do remember that very clearly. And, of course, it came out in 1927, years and years after the Jack the Ripper murders took place. But I was really thinking about the similarities between the Black Dahlia case and this movie, the Lodger. So I might try and see if there are actually some types of clues on how that film could have been an inspiration for the Black Dahlia murder, as opposed to only the photographer Man Ray. But to look at some other comments that you guys left, the killer was a horror freak determined to make people shocked. This came to us from Silver Stuff. The killer was a horror freak and determined to make people shocked. John Douglas said the exact same thing in The Cases That Haunt Us, that the person who committed the murder of Elizabeth Short wanted to do something horrific. They wanted to do something that would shock the general public. Her body was left there for a specific reason, and that is almost the only reason, other than perhaps taunting the authorities and the press. But all of that's the same. It's making an impact on people, and this person is letting everybody know that he committed the crime. And I think that this says a lot about what the killer was thinking and what he was trying to do. And, I mean, John Douglas could be right that this guy was somebody who was some type of borderline psychotic who was out of control, or to be clear, to use John Douglas's phrasings, somebody who had a mental disorder or a combination of mental disorders, possibly psychotic, and he had a very disorganized type of thinking, but still had a lot of awareness of what he was doing. Now, it could be something like that, or it could also just be someone who is extremely cold and calculating, but all of that, I think, points toward the mental illness factor to a certain extent. It's just about how much do we want to focus on that. Silver Stuff has another comment about George Hodel. One thing for sure about Hodel is that this genius pianist doctor was a sexual psychopath. Even putting murder aside, that is a fact. Wasn't Fauna the daughter of Hodel and Steve Hodel's sister? She was abused at parties and took her dad to court and lost. That's L.A. I mean, all right, okay, Silver Stuff, I follow everything that you were saying, but that was not Fauna Hodel, that was Tamar Hodel. Tamar Hodel was the daughter of George Hill Hodel, who accused him of sexual assault in 1949, and that's when they actually have the trial, and so on, and then he flees. I mean, not exactly fleeing, because, let's just say, Tamar Hodel accused him of sexual assault. It was even rumored at one time that Fauna Hodel, her daughter, was actually the biological child of George Hodel, and that is explored a lot in the drama series I Am the Night. But, I mean, Steve Hodel absolutely rejects that, and almost everybody rejects that because of the timeline. Fauna Hodel was born in 1951, and Tamar Hodel didn't have any contact with George Hodel after 1949, so we're talking about 2 years. The time frame just simply does not work out. And even if I've misquoted some of the years, it's been a while since I've looked at that stuff, but that is the biggest rebuttal, that there's no possible way that George Hodel actually had a child with his daughter, Tamar. And SC Chat says, are you aware of the podcast Root of Evil on Apple? The great-granddaughter of George Hodel hosts it. Listened to it about 5 years ago. Well, I'm definitely aware of it. And back in 2020, I was kind of pulled into the world of George Hodel. But again, it wasn't necessarily a Black Dahlia series because I was just looking at George Hodel and his role in Southern California. I did a standalone episode on him, and I think a lot of it was because of the publicity for the show I Am the Night with India Isley and Chris Pine. And I mean, I was aware of Root of Evil, and that was when they were just exploring not only the Black Dahlia case, but really they just wanted to look at the horrors that were going on in the Hodel family. Of course, Tamara Hodel accusing her father of sexual assault, Fauna Hodel growing up in just some very bizarre situations. And Fauna Hodel wrote her book, One Day She'll Darken, where her mother, Tamar, told her that her father was a black man, and she just grows up trying to convince everybody that she's African American, and then she learns the truth as a teenager. No, no, you're not half black, honey. And she is just absolutely shocked and mortified. And again, these are some just very bizarre stories, but I think they're very eye-opening for human behavior. And Rosemary Hoy has a comment here about Elizabeth Short. She was not a prostitute. She had functional malformation of her reproductive parts. And again, John Douglas actually talks about that in the book, The Cases That Haunt Us, when he says there are certain stories about Elizabeth Short's activities with men. And he just wants to say that a lot of them just exist as stories. And I mean, they're talking about very specific things about Elizabeth Short and her sex life. And I don't even want to make too many comments on that. But, I did say there was this disclaimer at the beginning, is reported that. And, I'm not even going to get into that stuff because just the point is that there are lots of stories, and John Douglas was saying that a lot of these stories about what she was doing with men are just that, stories, and they aren't easy to verify. Dave Smith left a comment on the last episode saying, in regards to the Black Dahlia murder, there is a mountain of compelling evidence, circumstantial, testimonial, and direct evidence against George Hodel, yet there is no exculpatory evidence for him. I believe Steve Hodel is the truth. I agree with you, Ned. The stuff about the Zodiac doesn't hold the same weight. Good video as always. Well, thank you so much, Dave, and no, I really just do not think at all that George Hodel was the Zodiac killer, and he most likely didn't start committing murders in 1921 at the age of 13, or whenever it was. Somebody had figured something out. Okay, let's look at this. Let's look at this just in terms of true crime history. He found out that his father was a suspect in the Black Dahlia case, so he began looking at other things and making connections, and he came to the conclusion that his father was responsible for dozens of murders. That might be connecting the dots in an inappropriate way. And going to the next one from Callias, who says, I'm so glad that you're going to cover this case. It's like you are in my mind. This and the Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac cases are my favorites. Greetings from Greece. Well, thank you so much to Callias. And again, as far as these Jack the Ripper parallels and inspirations, in very clearly about Jack the Ripper being an influence on the Black Dahlia Avenger, I do a segment every Wednesday about Jack the Ripper. Yesterday I was talking about the Jack the Ripper and Thames Torso connection, and I don't see any direct evidence that the Black Dahlia Avenger was trying to recreate Jack the Ripper's crimes, or that this was done in the tradition of Jack the Ripper. Yes, of course, there could have been some possible influence, again, from the movie The Lodger, or maybe that somebody was just thinking about how Jack the Ripper mutilated women, but that's quite possibly where it would end, because Jack the Ripper disemboweled the women by pulling out their organs. He also took organs as trophies like the uterus and the kidney, and Jack the Ripper mutilated the faces of two women, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Kelly. Mary Kelly was almost mutilated beyond recognition. But with the case of Elizabeth Short, she was given the Glasgow grin, where her mouth was cut almost into a permanent smile, going from the ear to the jaw, so to speak. And I'm just seeing some very, very different aspects, because one of the things that is discussed in the Ripper case is it's quite possible that Jack the Ripper had no medical expertise at all. Whereas with the Black Dahlia case, people seem pretty certain that they are dealing either with a medical professional or somebody who was a butcher or even someone who was an avid hunter, as John Douglas openly said in the book. With Jack the Ripper, it's possible that he was just somebody who was stabbing women and grabbing their organs. There is a much bigger set of possibilities that exist with the Ripper. So if anything, in the Black Dahlia case, this might help narrow down the suspect pool. And I guess I want to conclude with one thing about the psychological profile. Even though John Douglas does make a convincing case that this guy most likely was someone who was employed, he was most likely somebody who had funds, he was most likely somebody who had a mental disorder, all of that stuff, I think, is completely spot on. I want to be very, very clear. I think his observations about having his own house and his own car are most likely accurate. It's just, I wouldn't state them as certifiable facts that he did in the book The Cases That Haunt Us. I just proposed the alternatives because I wanted to keep somewhat of an open mind. And, I mean, what do you think about my comments about how she might have been murdered in a facility rather than a house? Some place like a slaughterhouse or a medical examination room because of access to a larger refrigerator, and also a place that would be less likely to be interrupted, not having neighbors being suspicious. What do you think about all of these things? And I'm going to look at other psychological profilers and their takes on the subject. There are a lot of psychological profiles that have been created about the Black Dahlia Avenger, but mostly people come back to the same points. They make the statements that it seems like there's some type of sexual sadist out there, someone who gets arousal from not only hurting women, but also somebody who was getting arousal from the dismembering, the mutilations, even if she would have been unconscious when they would have been taking place. This person was experiencing a very strong type of stimulation. So that also should go in there. And I mean, I don't think that there's much of a dispute in that. Now, as far as the actions and activities of the Avenger, this person also seems to have not only enjoyed physically hurting her body, but also emotionally hurting her and traumatizing her by forcing her to eat excrement, the humiliation aspect. All of that stuff would easily fit in to some type of sexual and emotional sadist. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. And as you see, if you leave a comment, it can be worked into a future episode of Black Box Online Radio. And this show comes to you Monday through Friday, sometimes bonus episodes on the weekends. And on Monday, I talk about the Zodiac Killer. On Wednesday, about Jack the Ripper. And on Tuesdays, about the case of JonBenet Ramsey. On Fridays, about D.B. Cooper. And now this is Dahlia Thursday. So if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com. Buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. There's a link for that in the description box. One more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want, and please look out for some bonus content that will be coming on the weekends. I also release shorts and reels on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, blackboxned88 on Instagram, and I will see you over there. Until next time.